Welcome, children of the light. I would like to welcome you to this beautiful podcast. And today we're going to be discussing a very interesting topic, a very intimate topic, which is going to be philosophical, spiritual, as well as psychological. The topic of today is the 5 elements. The 5 elements. So before we begin the lecture, I would like to give a disclaimer that this information is given merely for educational purposes. And the listeners who do receive this information bear the responsibility to use it for their own good or for their own destruction. In other words, this is merely information which is given. It is just knowledge. Your understanding and your actions which follow the information are merely your actions. If you do not like such information, then I sincerely implore you to tune out and find something else to do. If you are, however, feeling that you want to find out more about these philosophical, spiritual, and psychological topics, and you are courageous enough to walk down this path of understanding and knowledge, then you feel free to tune in, and you can take it as entertainment, you can take it as music, you can take it as something that helps you sleep. Whatever works for you. Here we go. So the title of this one is the 5 elements, as I've mentioned. Now, the 5 elements in philosophy are a very interesting subject because growing up, most of us would have heard of the 4 elements, which are mainly water, air, earth, and fire. These are the 4 elements which are commonly talked about in philosophy, and growing up we're told that these elements are the only elements which they are, or the only elements which exist in nature. So today we're going to not only talk about the 4 elements, but indeed we're going to mention the 5th element, which is probably the most important amongst these elements. So the presentation is going to be divided into 3 sections. It will not be as formal as most presentations. It is going to be very free, meditative, intuitive, contemplative. I will try to make it as interesting as possible. So, the first element which is discussed usually in philosophical topics is the element of the earth, because it is the most visible, it is easier to understand, and it is not hidden from plain sight. It is easier to just look around you and you see matter, you see the earth, right? So this element, earth, is the first one which is discussed in most philosophical literature. Now, why talk about this stuff now? Why is it important to uncover these ancient philosophical traditions? Why should we do it? Well, the reason why is because philosophy has been sort of put into the background. It is sort of shunned, and yet all the modern social sciences, psychology, sociology, they're dead, and allegiance to grandpa philosophy. I call it grandpa philosophy because it is indeed like a grandpa, in the background, just waiting for those prodigal sons to come back, those lost souls to come back to Papa and say, well, we tried our best, but we couldn't figure that out. Do you have any wise ideas? And Grandpa Philosophy comes by and says, I knew you'd come back. Welcome back. The first element is the element of the earth. Okay, so we want to relate ourselves, our existence, to these philosophical understandings. Okay, the earth in most philosophical traditions is basically our own physical bodies. It is the element which has the following attributes. 1. It has the attribute or the trait of being dense. It has another attribute or trait of being grounded. It has another attribute of being balanced, coarse, heavy, as well as being concentrated. Okay, this is the earth element, its traits, its characteristics. Okay, now as I am giving you these characteristics, I want you to transcend your understanding. Don't think of this as physical earth, but think of it as psychological, spiritual values. Okay, these are values. Think of them as spiritual values, or if you don't like the term spiritual, you can think of them as psychological traits, psychological values, right? So the earth element has a tendency to want to be stable. Okay, if you think of a personality of a person who is earthly, we would say they don't like change. Okay, they want things fixed and stay the same, basically, right? So that's basically humanity as physical organisms. Most of us at least would say we don't like change, right? If my body's like this, just leave my body like this. Changing it is just I gotta do all that just to change my body. It takes a lot of time, right? So the earth element is very resistant to change. That's why it's balanced. Water can flow right on the shore and hit the rocky sides, but the rocks are not gonna budge. They won't budge. So it's stubborn, it's coarse, it's grounded, it's dense. So that was the first element in philosophy, the earth element. And the ancient philosophers understood it by observing nature's dense and coarse material, like rocks and mountains. They barely change. The same mountain will be the same in 5 years. It looks the same, even though it changes slowly, but pretty much you can tell it's the same mountain. So basically, pretty much you can still tell this is the same person that I saw yesterday, because their physical body is an earthly element, even though there are tiny changes if you use a microscope. But nevertheless, you can recognize, well, I saw you yesterday, I see you today, probably 2 days from now you probably look like this. Doesn't change. Next element which is discussed in philosophy is the element of water. The water element. Now, the water element has the following characteristics, the following attributes. It has a characteristic of being fluid. It flows. It is adaptable. It takes the path of least resistance. At the same time, the water element also has the characteristics of not being too dense. In other words, it is light in its fluidity. This is the water element, the element which flows, goes with the flow, takes the path of least resistance. It is very easy it is malleable, in other words, unlike earth. So it is not as fixed as the earth element. Indeed, the water element goes everywhere. It penetrates. It is very penetrative. It goes into the deepest lows and comes from the highest heights. It is the element of water which manages, nourishes nature itself. It gives life. All life emerges from these waters. The water element, the element which the fish, creatures of the sea, many creatures are nourished by the water element. Indeed, it is even assumed by certain philosophers in the past that the water element is where humanity comes from, in the sense that human beings are mostly water than earth. We outwardly have this shell of earthly features, right? But ancient philosophers would have said that human beings come from the water element, and most of their human physical features are rooted, all of them in fact, rooted in this water element. So these philosophers, if we try and study how they could see the world, their perspective, their understanding, we notice that this water element, if we try to bring it into modern terms, we could look at it in terms of personality or psychological traits that people have. People who are magnetized towards the water element are not really fixed, right? So they have a personality which allows them to be adaptable, to travel, to penetrate in places that seem impossible to go into. They can go to many places, right? They have so much fuel to keep on moving, even though they face obstacles, because no obstacle can stop water. Water will not fight, but it will pass you. It will pass through that obstacle. So water cannot be stopped in that sense. So you could look at it as that psychological trait of being able to penetrate everywhere into the deepest lows, and at the same time spreading yourself in such a way that it is hard to contain you. So that's the water element, right? If you get in touch with your water element, these elements, remember, are not things that are outside us. Like I said, these are spiritual values, these are psychological traits. I would love to use the term spiritual values because it's much more potent as compared to psychological traits, because psychological traits usually can be classified in psychological terms, and I will not be using too many psychological terms here in this podcast today. Rather, I'll be using mostly spiritual and philosophical terms. So getting in touch with your water element means that you flow. You're not resisting, and at the same time you are not fighting, but rather you understand that being water is much more sweeter, much more freedom in being water, in being a liquid that just goes everywhere and cannot be contained or crystallized into matter. So there is a certain freedom that comes when one gets in touch with that water element, when the water element spiritualizes your spirit in such a way that you're no longer caged in matter, you're no longer caged in dense thoughts of this world. So many problems in this world, all of them are rooted in density, earth, matter. But the water element comes in and says, wow, look at this. You could be all over the place, everywhere, flowing, spreading, becoming expansively fluid, no longer caged by matter or matters. So, the water element, according to philosophers, as I talked about, has that fluidity. It is literally floating on top of water. and being as relaxed as one possibly can. Your physical body should not interfere with this relaxation of your mind and spirit. It should be completely relaxed. Like water does not just become hard. It is very relaxed. It's very relaxed. No effort, no fighting, no forcing. Just relaxed. And you will get to your destination in this vibration of fluidity. Because water does not rush, and yet everything gets done. It nourishes all creatures, it nourishes all nature, and yet it does not rush. It does not rush. It's very relaxed. So that's the second element that we have talked about, the water element. As we go up above this ladder of the elements, the 5 elements, we come to our third circle, our third element, our third sphere, our third. Third element is the element of fire. Now, the fire element, according to ancient philosophers, was that element which was very mysterious, because no one could ever understand. In fact, in certain philosophical literature, they always say the fire element is the one element that no one can say where it came from, and yet it exists. It is said that beyond the fire element is a space which cannot be named. So this fire element was very mysterious. Indeed, when mankind first invented fire, it was something magical. It was something to stand back and wow at. It was very mysterious. What is fire in the first place? Fire brings light, fire brings heat, fire brings death, fire brings all those things which man looks at as mysterious, because it comes and goes and comes and goes, and yet no one sees where it comes from. So the ancient philosophers thought of fire as mysterious. It has the following attributes. The fire element can be characterized by a trait of fury, a trait of anger, a trait of destruction. So this is the fire element when it is out of control. It becomes rageful. A raging fire destroys. It consumes everything around it until it burns everything to ashes. That's one aspect. The other trait of the fire element is the fire element in its gentle form: loving, warm, kind, present, gentle, and penetrative in terms of temperature. So the fire element was also the element of love, the element which brings warmth when it is cold, the element which brings that sense of presence, which is why people in ancient times would sit around the fire. Nothing else mattered in that moment except that fire and that circle, because they knew deep down this fire element, this element is mysterious. No one can name where it comes from, and yet when it is on, everyone wants to look at it. This is the fire element, bringing warmth, connecting people together, and of course bringing light in the darkness. It brought light into the darkness. The fire element could be lit, and light would show the surroundings. The light would show the earth. The light would show the waters. The light would show the trees. The light would show everything that was in that surrounding would be lit by the fire. Not the consuming fire, but the light of the fire. So light comes from fire. Light comes from that destructive fire. When it is maintained, when it is harnessed and kept at a gentle a gentle burning way, rather, the fire can actually provide light for a very long time and for a considerable distance. So the fire element was also that element which most religions became centered around the fire element. In Judeo-Christian literature, they sometimes describe the Almighty God as a consuming fire, a fire which consumes one. That is to say, it at the same time it's destroying, but it's destroying in a way that which is destroyed becomes the fire, becomes the light. So it does not merely destroy, it destroys and creates in the exact same moment. In other words, as fire burns, more light. As fire burns, more light. As fire burns, but the light is coming from that which is being burnt as well. So the earth would be burnt by the fire to provide light. This is obvious. If you want to light a fire, you get your firewood, you get your papers, you get your plastics, you throw it in the fire to keep the fire going. So most people would sacrifice people to the fire gods in ancient philosophy literature. You would have certain cultures which would try to sacrifice people to fire because they assumed to keep the fire alive, to keep the fire lit, they needed to keep throwing things in it so that it keeps burning. So philosophical literature is very concerned with the fire element. It is an element which is very interesting because at the same time that it gives light, it has this double polarity of also burning the entire landscape. So philosophers and alchemists in the past would describe the fire element as an element which could only be handled by masters. It was an element which could only be handled by the adept, those who were skilled in what they were doing, because it could run amok and burn the entire landscape, causing chaos, destroying even the entire planet. The entire human species could become threatened by this fire element. Remember, physically, yes, of course, but most importantly, spiritually, the fire element could destroy. At the same time, like we mentioned, it could also give light. So working with the fire element in its gentle aspect would make you warm, caring, loving, gentle, and balanced. But above all these words, attentive. Okay, a master who has mastered the fire element is very attentive in every moment, because at any moment someone can trigger you and you could become very angry, and that fire element could just rampage and burn everybody around you. Trust me, it is possible. It happens on a daily basis. People get furious, they get enraged by fire, and all they want to do is just burn people, burn them, right? And in Judeo-Christian literature, in James, the book of James, the fire element is talked about as the tongue. The tongue is described as a flaming sword, a flame which cannot be tamed, a fire which cannot be tamed. So in Judeo-Christian literature, and specifically the book of James, the fire element is talked about as being related to the tongue. Again, the polarity, notice the polarity. The fire element as the tongue can burn, or it can give light, it can give love, it can heal. Two sides of the fire element: light or darkness. Furthermore, in the book of James, the fire element is also talked about when James states that a man can set a man's soul on fire using the tongue. The tongue can cause more darkness than any other member of the human body. So this is paraphrasing what James states in Judeo-Christian literature about this fire element, which can be expressed through the tongue. A man curses and blesses with the same tongue. At the same time, I'm assuming that we also kiss our beloved wives, kiss our beloved children with the same tongue. And this is the same tongue we use to curse and bless. So it is a polarity, it is a fire. Which is why I said one who masters the fire element has to be very attentive. Very attentive. Attentive and paying attention. In order to maintain that fire so that it does not go out of control. It needs to be maintained with a gentle heat, very gently, to give light. So it is important in that sense. So as you can see, we could go on and on and on about the fire element. It is very mysteriously profound, really. Moving on to our fourth element, which is the second from last, the air element, the element of the air. Now, in ancient philosophical traditions, such as, I will not be going into the details of the traditions, but in one tradition, they do mention the air element as an element which is mobile. So the water element, remember, is fluid, it flows, but the air element is mobile. It can move very fast to many different places, just like the air. There is no way that you can go where there's no air. Physically speaking, if you go to that side of the room, there's air. If you go to the next town, there's air. The next country, there's air. So it is mobile, moves everywhere. Sometimes it moves very fast, sometimes it is gentle, but it has this element of being transient and very mysteriously intangible. So this is the air element. Now, in psychology, the air element is related to the mind. The mind and the air were very much related in philosophical traditions as well as modern psychology. Indeed, they would describe the air as a bird, the bird of the mind, which can fly using the air to go to many different places. It has transcended the waters, it has transcended the fires below, and at the same time it has obviously transcended the earth. So it was a very high element, very high. It could see across the landscape to see that the entire earth was indeed below the air element, making it a very high element. So when we look at this in our relationship to it, we notice our bodies are very limited. We could, if I could think of going to the next country in a split second. That's my mind traveling, going distant lands, whilst my body is still here. My body cannot just do that. It is limited because it is in the terrains, in the jungle, in the mountains, whereas the mind has transcended this type of topography. Okay, the mind is now operating with the air element on a different scale or a different dimension. The topography has changed. The dimensions free as you transcend upwards, these elements are becoming more and more expansive, more free and unlimited. So the air element is an element which is free. Just like a bird, it is free. Okay, the bird can be right here on the ground, and the next moment it is very, very far away. Very far away. Well, as the earth would take time to move physically to that point which the mind can think of. So your mind can imagine distant places, imaginary places, places that do exist, and be there. But your body would take considerable amounts of time to get there. A considerable amount of time to get there. So the air element was also related to the intellect, the mind, and how it can pierce into reality in such a way that physical matter cannot. To see beyond matter is to be in touch with the air element, to be in touch with that element which transcends physical, dense topography. Also related to beings which could fly. They could fly over the landscape. They could see what was happening below. They could see what was happening sometimes even in the waters with that very acute eye vision, because the mind will have transcended in such a way that it can go to the highest heights and to see the earth as just a small little island. So the air element had this potential. Getting in touch with one's air element means that one is able to be mobile with their mind. One is able to be very quick, very mobile, very able to switch from one state to another using their mind. Because the mind is thoughts. The thoughts come like a wind, they go like a wind, and no one can really stop thoughts because they are related with the air element.